In the frozen wilderness of northern Montana, two strangers' lives became fatefully intertwined through a single photograph. Stranded in the deadliest blizzard to hit the region in decades, Eliza Winters clung to life with nothing but a silver locket and fading hope. Miles away, Mason Reed, a solitary wolf trapper, felt an inexplicable pull toward the mountains, unaware that his own image was clasped in the hands of a woman fighting to survive. This is the remarkable story of how a photograph connected two souls across the vast, unforgiving wilderness, and how fate sometimes writes the most unbelievable stories. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The northern Montana wilderness in January was not for the faint of heart. Most locals knew better than to venture deep into the Bitterroot Range during winter, especially with storm warnings blaring across every radio station and weather app. But Eliza Winters wasn't a local, at least not anymore. 32 years old, with auburn hair tucked beneath a wool beanie, Eliza drove her rented Jeep Cherokee along the winding mountain road with determination etched across her face. 6 hours earlier, she'd landed at Helena Regional Airport, with nothing but a backpack containing essentials and a small silver locket hanging around her neck. The rental car agent had tried to dissuade her from heading toward the mountains. "Ma'am, there's a serious system moving in. They're saying it could be the worst in 20 years. Maybe reconsider your timing?" he'd suggested, sliding the keys across the counter with evident reluctance. "I don't have that luxury," Eliza had replied, her voice level despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. "But thank you for your concern." Now, as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall against her windshield, Eliza second-guessed her stubbornness. The narrow road was already slick, and visibility was deteriorating by the minute. Her GPS had lost signal 30 minutes ago, leaving her with only the paper map spread across her passenger seat and memories nearly 15 years old. She reached up absent-mindedly to touch the silver locket at her throat, a habit formed over the past 8 months since her grandmother's death. Inside was a faded photograph of a young man with intense eyes and a half-smile, standing beside a cabin with mountains rising behind him. On the back of the photo, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, "Mason Reed, Bitterroot Valley, 1993. The secret her grandmother had revealed on her deathbed had upended everything Eliza thought she knew about herself. The revelation had sent her on this journey, driving into a blizzard to find a man who had no idea she existed. "Just a little farther," she whispered to herself, squinting at the road ahead as the snow fell harder. According to her map, the turn-off to the old logging road should be coming up soon, and from there it was another 7 miles to where the cabin might still stand. The wind picked up suddenly, howling across the landscape and rocking the Jeep. Eliza gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening. The temperature gauge on her dashboard was dropping rapidly, already well below freezing and still falling. The heater struggled against the intensifying cold, and Eliza's breath began to fog in front of her. She almost missed the turnoff, a narrow break in the trees, marked only by a weathered wooden post. Slowing carefully, she made the turn onto the unpaved road, which was already covered in several inches of fresh powder. The Jeep's tires slipped momentarily before finding purchase, and Eliza felt a bead of sweat form at her temple, despite the cold. 10 minutes later, the road conditions had deteriorated dramatically. The snow was falling so heavily that her windshield wipers could barely keep up, and the wind was driving white sheets across her path. Visibility had dropped to mere feet. Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she continued forward at a crawl, knowing she'd come too far to turn back now. A sudden gust slammed into the vehicle, momentarily blinding her with a white wall of snow. When it cleared, Eliza gasped and slammed on the brakes. A massive fallen pine blocked the road completely. The jeep skidded, fishtailing on the slick surface. Eliza fought the wheel, but the vehicle's momentum carried it toward the edge of the road. She felt the stomach-dropping sensation of tires losing contact with solid ground, and then the jeep was tipping, rolling down the embankment. The world spun violently around her. The airbag deployed with a deafening pop, slamming into her chest and face. Glass shattered, metal crunched, and finally everything came to a stop, with the jeep resting on its side in a small ravine about 15 feet below the road. For several long moments, Eliza remained still, suspended by her seatbelt, taking inventory of her body. Her head throbbed where it had struck the window despite the airbag, and her right arm radiated pain from shoulder to fingers. But she could move, could breathe. Alive, then, fumbling with her left hand, she managed to release the seatbelt, bracing herself to avoid falling against the driver's side door. The cold was already seeping into the vehicle, and Eliza could see her breath forming thicker clouds with each exhale. Outside, the snow continued to fall relentlessly. "Hello?" she called out reflexively, though she knew there would be no answer. She'd passed no other vehicles for the last 40 minutes of her drive. Cell service had disappeared along with her GPS signal. No one knew exactly where she was, and no one would be coming to help. Survival instincts kicked in. Eliza had been raised in Montana until she was 17, and her father had taught her enough about wilderness survival to know she needed to act fast. The temperature was plummeting, and nightfall would only make things worse. Her backpack had been thrown into the back seat during the crash, and she awkwardly maneuvered to retrieve it. Inside were a few energy bars, a water bottle, matches, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and extra layers. Nowhere near enough for an extended stay in blizzard conditions, but it was something. She also had her winter coat, gloves, and the clothes she was wearing. Her right arm protested as she pulled on an additional sweater from her pack, but she managed. The next challenge was getting out of the vehicle. The passenger door was now above her, and after several painful attempts, Eliza managed to push it open against the force of the wind and snow. Climbing out was an ordeal that left her gasping with pain from her injured arm, but eventually she stood beside the wrecked jeep, the snow already up to her ankles and still accumulating rapidly. Looking up at the steep embankment to the road, Eliza knew she couldn't climb it safely with her injured arm, especially not in these conditions. Her best hope was to follow the ravine, which appeared to widen into a narrow valley ahead. Perhaps she could find some natural shelter, a cave or rock outcropping, to wait out the worst of the storm. With her backpack secured over her left shoulder, Eliza began to trudge through the deepening snow, the wind cutting through her layers. Despite her best efforts, the locket bounced against her collarbone with each step, a constant reminder of why she had come. Mason Reed, the man in the photograph, the wolf trapper who had spent decades in these mountains, the man her grandmother had loved once, long ago, the man who, if her grandmother's deathbed confession was true, was Eliza's grandfather. "I never told anyone," her grandmother had whispered, clutching Eliza's hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Not even your mother knew. But you deserve the truth. You have his eyes, his determination. The locket. Take it. Find him if he's still alive. Tell him about me, about you." Now, pushing forward through snow that reached mid-calf, Eliza wondered if her impulsive journey would end before it truly began. The cold was becoming dangerous, seeping into her bones. The visibility had dropped to almost nothing, with the wall of white broken only by the dark shapes of trees. She had no way to know if she was heading toward potential safety or deeper into danger. After what felt like hours but was likely less than one, Eliza's legs began to tremble with fatigue. Her injured arm had gone numb, which she knew wasn't a good sign. The ravine had indeed widened into a small valley, but offered no immediate shelter, just endless snow, trees, and the howling wind that seemed determined to push her back with every step. When she stumbled for the third time, barely, catching herself from falling face first into the snow, Eliza knew she needed to make a decision. Wilderness survival rule number 1. Find shelter. Without it, exposure would kill her long before starvation or dehydration became concerns. Through the curtain of snow, Eliza spotted a darker shape ahead, not the vertical line of trees, but something different. Hope surged within her as she forced her frozen legs to carry her forward. The shape gradually resolved into a rock formation, a small cliff face with what appeared to be a shallow overhang. Not ideal, but better than nothing. The final distance to the overhang seemed to stretch impossibly, but finally Eliza collapsed beneath it, grateful for even this minimal protection from the direct onslaught of snow. The space was perhaps 4 feet deep at its maximum, with a height that allowed her to sit but not stand. The ground was rocky and cold, but dry in comparison to the world outside. With trembling hands, Eliza opened her backpack. First priority, warmth. She needed to get warm or stay warm enough to survive until the storm passed. From her limited supplies, she pulled out a space blanket, the thin, metallic emergency blanket she'd thrown into her pack as an afterthought. It wouldn't provide much insulation, but it would help reflect her body heat. Next, she assessed the possibility of a fire. The overhang offered some protection, and she had matches, but fuel would be a problem. The nearest trees were 20 yards away, and their branches would be wet with snow. Still, she had to try. Move or die, she muttered to herself, forcing her body back out into the storm. At the nearest pine tree, she broke off the lowest branches. She could reach, searching for the driest sections beneath the larger boughs. By the time she returned to the overhang, her gloves were soaked through and her fingers burned with cold. Creating a fire proved nearly impossible. The wood was too wet, the wind too persistent. After using half her matches, Eliza managed to get a small flame going, but it sputtered weakly and produced more smoke than heat before dying out completely. She was down to her last 3 matches when she finally admitted defeat. Night was approaching, the dim winter daylight fading rapidly. Without fire, Eliza's chances of surviving the night dropped dramatically. The temperature would continue to plummet after sundown, and her wet clothing would become a death trap rather than protection. She changed into the dry layers from her backpack, wrapping her wet outer clothing around her backpack to create a makeshift pillow. Then she cocooned herself in the space blanket as best she could, tucking her hands beneath her armpits and drawing her knees to her chest to conserve body heat. The locket pressed against her sternum, and Eliza pulled it out. Holding it tightly in her palm, the small silver oval had been her grandmother's most treasured possession, though Eliza had never understood why until recently. Now, as the cold seeped into her despite all her efforts, she carefully opened it with numb fingers. The young man in the photograph stared back at her, frozen in time. Dark hair falling across his forehead, a face weathered by the elements but handsome nonetheless, eyes that seemed to see right through the camera to the person behind it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Those eyes that her grandmother had claimed Eliza inherited. In the fading light, she couldn't make out much more than his silhouette, but she knew every detail by heart after staring at it for countless hours during the past months. "I tried," she whispered to the photographer, her voice carried away by the wind. "I really tried." The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying as night fell. Eliza's eyelids grew heavy, and she fought to keep them open, knowing that falling asleep in these conditions could be fatal. But her body was shutting down, conservation mode kicking in as her core temperature dropped dangerously low. Her last conscious thought was of the irony. Coming all this, way to find her grandfather, only to die in the same wilderness he had made his home. The locket remained clutched in her fist as consciousness slipped away. Miles away, in a sturdy cabin built with his own hands, Mason Reed sat by his wood stove, listening to the fury of the storm outside. At 63, he'd seen many winters in these mountains, but something about this blizzard felt different. A restlessness had taken hold of him since morning, a feeling he couldn't shake, no matter how he tried to distract himself. The radio crackled with the latest update. Worst blizzard to hit the northern Bitterroot in 25 years. All residents are advised to remain indoors. Search and rescue operations are suspended until conditions improve. Mason stared into the flames of his stove, absent-mindedly running his thumb over the carved wooden wolf figurine in his hand. A habit when he was troubled. Something was pulling at him, an instinct honed by decades of survival in the wilderness. Something was wrong. His two timber wolf hybrids, Ash and Timber, suddenly raised their heads from where they'd been sleeping by the fire, ears perked forward. A moment later, they were on their feet, moving to the door with purpose, whining softly. "What is it, boys?" Mason asked, setting aside the carving and rising to his feet. The dogs rarely behaved this way without cause. They wanted out, despite the raging storm, and Mason had learned long ago to trust their instincts above all else. A decision formed in his mind, against all logic and reason. He would go out, despite the blizzard, despite the warnings. Something, or someone needed him, and Mason Reed had never been one to ignore such a call. As he pulled on his heaviest winter gear and prepared his emergency pack, he had no way of knowing that his own image was clutched in the fading grasp of a young woman who carried his blood, a woman whose life now hung by the thinnest of threads in the merciless cold of the Montana wilderness. Mason Reed moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared to venture into the blizzard. After 38 years living in these mountains, his routine for emergency expeditions was second nature. Thick wool-lined pants, 3 layers on top, his heavy beaver fur coat, insulated boots rated for -40, and his specialized trapper's gear, including a pack with survival essentials. "Easy now," he murmured to Ash and Timber as they paced, anxiously by the door, their massive paws padding silently across the wooden floor. The 2 wolf dogs were his most trusted companions, bred from a timber wolf his father had rescued decades ago and trained meticulously since they were pups. Their senses far exceeded human capability, and that's exactly what Mason needed tonight. He attached leads to their specialized harnesses, not to control them, but to maintain contact in the whiteout conditions. Then he secured his snowshoes, rifle and emergency pack. The last item he grabbed was a heavy walking staff with a metal spike at the bottom, essential for testing ice and snow depth. "Ready to work?" he asked the animals, who responded with focused attention, their yellow eyes locked on his face. Unlike ordinary dogs, they didn't wag or bark. They simply prepared, conserving energy for the task ahead. Mason opened the cabin door, and the full force of the blizzard assaulted them. The wind howled through the trees, driving snow horizontally. Temperature was well below zero, even without the wind chill. Any exposed skin would freeze in minutes under these conditions. Normal men stayed inside during storms like this, but Mason Reed had never been normal. The mountain locals called him the Lone Wolf, and not just because of his unusual companions. For nearly 4 decades, he'd lived on this remote mountainside, coming into town only when absolutely necessary for supplies. Most residents of the nearest town, Pinewood Ridge, knew of him, but had never actually spoken to him. "Find," Mason commanded, giving his companions the signal to work. Immediately, Ash and Timber lowered their noses, moving in tandem as they navigated the deep snow. Mason followed, the snowshoes keeping him from sinking too deeply into the fresh powder. They moved away from the cabin on a northeasterly heading, directly into the teeth of the storm. Mason couldn't have explained even to himself exactly what pulled him in this direction. The wolf dogs sensed something, and over the years he'd learned their instincts were rarely wrong. They'd found lost hikers before, usually in warmer months, when tourists ventured unprepared into the wilderness, but never in conditions like this. The going was brutal. Even with snowshoes, each step required significant effort. The wind sliced through every tiny gap in his clothing, and ice formed on his beard and eyebrows. Mason kept track of time and direction, basic survival skills that had become as automatic as breathing. 20 minutes out from the cabin, half a mile, give or take, considering the conditions. Suddenly, Ash froze, head up, testing the air. Timber followed suit a moment later. Mason stopped watching them. Their behavior had shifted from searching to alertness. They'd caught something. "What have you got?" Mason asked, his words immediately swallowed by the howling wind. Ash jerked his head, pulling on the lead, eager to move faster. Mason gave them more slack, and the animals increased their pace, changing direction slightly to follow whatever scent had caught their attention. They were heading toward the valley now, away from the main ridge path. Mason frowned. Nobody should be down there, especially not in this weather. They descended a steep slope, Mason using his staff for balance. The trees provided minimal shelter from the direct force of the wind, but the snow was deeper here, protected from the scouring effect of the gale. Every few minutes, Mason paused to get his bearings, mentally mapping their route back to the cabin. After another 15 minutes of difficult travel, they reached the bottom of a shallow ravine that opened into the small valley. The wolf dogs' behavior became more urgent, pulling harder on their leads. Whatever they sensed was close now. Mason scanned the area, but visibility was poor, perhaps 20 feet at most in the driving snow. Then he saw it, a dark shape against the white landscape, not moving. His heart sank. In these conditions, stillness usually meant death. He pushed forward, the wolf dogs now breaking trail as they approached what Mason could now make out as a human form huddled against a rock overhang. "Hello?" he called, out, though he expected no response. "Can you hear me?" The figure didn't stir. Drawing closer, Mason could see it was a woman, curled into a fetal position beneath what looked like an emergency blanket, now partially covered with drifting snow. She was small-framed, auburn hair visible beneath a snow-dusted beanie. Her face was alarmingly pale, lips tinged blue. Mason dropped to his knees beside her, pulling off his thick glove to press fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. For several long seconds, he felt nothing, and grief washed over him, too. Late again, but then, faintly, he detected it, a thread-like pulse, sluggish but present. "Still with us," he muttered, relief flooding through him. But she wouldn't be for long without immediate intervention. Her core temperature had dropped dangerously low. Severe hypothermia had set in. Mason worked quickly. First, he needed to shield her from further exposure. He cleared snow from the overhang area, creating more space. From his pack, he pulled an emergency shelter, a small, ultralight tent designed for alpine emergencies. With practiced movements, he set it up within the overhang's protection, creating a double barrier against the elements. Next, he carefully gathered the unconscious woman. As he lifted her, something fell from her half-closed fist, a small silver object on a chain. Mason scooped it up without examining it and placed it in his pocket before carrying her into the emergency shelter. The wind dogs crowded in as well, their body heat an additional resource. Mason knew the protocol for severe hypothermia, gradual, rewarming to avoid shock. He unrolled his emergency sleeping bag, rated for extreme sub-zero temperatures, and carefully placed the woman inside. Her clothing was dangerously damp in places. Those layers would need to come off. With the efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency medical situations, Mason removed her wet outer layers, leaving only dry base layers for modesty. He then placed heat packs, activated by exposure to air near her core areas, armpits, groin, neck and chest, but not directly against her skin to avoid burning. The woman didn't stir during this process, which concerned him deeply. Next, he pulled out his emergency satellite phone, one of his few concessions to modern technology, maintained for exactly this type of situation. The signal was weak in the storm, but it connected. "Search and rescue, this is Mason Reed," he said, having to nearly shout over the wind even inside the shelter. "I found a female, approximately 30 years old, severe hypothermia, pulse present, but weak, unresponsive. Located in East Bitterroot Valley, approximately 1 mile northeast of my cabin." The response was broken, static cutting through the transmission. "Conditions too severe. No aircraft. Ground teams cannot." Mason understood even through the fragmented message. No rescue was coming. Not until the storm passed, which weather reports suggested wouldn't be until morning at the earliest. This woman's life was in his hands alone. "Understood," he replied. "Will attempt transport to my cabin if condition stabilizes. Will update in 2 hours or if the situation changes." After ending the call, Mason settled in for the critical task of keeping the woman alive through the night. The wolf dogs positioned themselves on either side of the sleeping bag, their body heat helping to warm the small space. Mason monitored her pulse and breathing continuously, watching for any signs of improvement or deterioration. An hour passed with agonizing slowness. The woman remained unconscious, but her pulse had strengthened slightly, and her breathing seemed less shallow. Her skin remained frighteningly pale, but the blue tinge to her lips had diminished somewhat. Mason decided it was time to attempt the journey back to the cabin. She needed proper warmth and medical attention beyond what he could provide in this makeshift shelter. Carefully, he wrapped her in the sleeping bag, securing it tightly. He dismantled the emergency shelter and repacked his gear with one hand while keeping her close with the other. The wolf dogs seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, standing alert and ready. "Let's go home," Mason told them, cradling the woman against his chest. The journey back would be even more arduous than the journey out, uphill in deteriorating conditions, carrying precious cargo. The first stretch was the hardest, climbing out of the valley up the steep ravine. Mason's legs burned with the effort, but decades of mountain living had made him stronger than men half his age. He set a careful pace, prioritizing stability over speed. A fall now could be catastrophic for them both. Halfway up the ravine, the woman stirred slightly in his arms, a small moan escaping her lips. Mason paused, shifting her weight to look at her face. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. "You're safe," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I've got you." Her hand moved weakly, as if searching for something. Mason remembered the silver object that had fallen from her grasp earlier. With difficulty, he shifted her weight and retrieved it from his pocket, placing it in her seeking fingers. Her hand closed around it weakly, and she seemed to settle. Only then did Mason notice what the object was, a silver locket on a fine chain. Something about it triggered a distant memory, but he couldn't place it, and now wasn't the time for distractions. He continued the grueling climb out of the ravine. The storm had intensified further, visibility dropping to almost nothing at times. Without ash and timber leading the way, finding the cabin would have been nearly impossible. Mason followed their sure-footed path, trusting their homing instinct. His arms ached from carrying the woman, but he didn't dare stop to rest. Her life depended on reaching shelter and proper warmth as quickly as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dark shape of the cabin appeared through the curtain of snow. Mason had never been so grateful to see those log walls. With the last of his strength, he pushed forward, reaching the door and shouldering it open. The blast of warmth from the wood stove hit him like a physical force. He'd banked the fire before leaving, and the cabin had maintained most of its heat. Mason carried the woman directly to his bed, placing her gently on the handmade quilt before turning to stoke the fire to maximum output. Ash and timber shook themselves, sending snow flying, then moved to their usual spots near the hearth, watching with intelligent eyes as Mason bustled around the cabin. He gathered medical supplies, additional blankets, and prepared hot water bottles. With the cabin warming rapidly, Mason turned his full attention to his unexpected guest. In the proper light, he could see her features clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd initially estimated, early 30s perhaps. Her face, though pale and drawn from her ordeal, was striking, with high cheekbones and a determined set to her jaw even in unconsciousness. Something about her features tugged at Mason's memory, creating an unsettling sense of familiarity he couldn't place. He checked her vitals again, pulse stronger, breathing more regular. Her body temperature was still dangerously low, but the worst of the crisis appeared to be passing. Mason carefully applied warm compresses to her neck, armpits, and groin, the areas where major blood vessels ran close to the surface. While tending to her, he noticed her hand was still clutched tightly around the silver locket. Gently, he tried to loosen her grip to make her more comfortable, but even in her weakened state, she resisted. "All right," he murmured. "You can keep it." Mason pulled a chair beside the bed and settled in for a long night of monitoring. Hypothermia. Recovery was unpredictable, and complications could arise suddenly. He wouldn't rest until he was certain she was stable. As the fire crackled and the storm raged outside, Mason found himself studying the woman's face, trying to place that nagging sense of recognition. He'd been isolated in these mountains for so long that he knew it was unlikely he'd met her before, and yet something about her eyes, even closed, struck a chord deep within him. Hours passed. Mason dozed intermittently in the chair, always waking to check on his patient. Her color had improved significantly, and her breathing had deepened into what seemed like normal sleep rather than unconsciousness. Around 3 a.m, she began to stir more purposefully. Mason leaned forward, alert. Her eyelids fluttered, then finally opened. Disoriented green eyes, a striking shade between emerald and forest, darted around the unfamiliar surroundings before settling on his face. For a moment, she simply stared at him, confusion evident. Then her eyes widened, with recognition, though Mason was certain they'd never met. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, with trembling fingers, she raised the silver locket she'd been clutching. Mason watched, puzzled, as she struggled to open it. He leaned forward to help, gently taking it from her. Weak grasp. The clasp was old and stiff, but it yielded to his practiced fingers. As the locket opened in his palm, Mason found himself looking at a photograph he'd nearly forgotten existed. A young man with dark hair and intense eyes stood before a cabin, this cabin, 30 years younger. It was himself, in his mid-20s, shortly after he'd finished building this place. A photograph taken by the realization hit him like a physical blow. He knew exactly who had taken this picture on a warm summer day in 1993. Catherine Sullivan, Kate, the only woman he'd ever truly loved. The woman who had left these mountains, and him, without explanation, never to return. Mason's eyes shot to the woman's face, seeing it now with terrible clarity. The resemblance was unmistakable, those same green eyes that had haunted his dreams for decades. The same determined set of the jaw, but this couldn't be Kate. This woman was far too young. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman swallowed with difficulty, her voice emerging as a croak after her ordeal. Eliza, she managed. Eliza Winters. The surname meant nothing to him, but that did nothing to diminish the shock coursing through his system. Eliza raised a weak hand, pointing first to the photograph, then to him. "You're Mason Reed," she said, her voice gaining strength. "My grandmother was Catherine Sullivan." Mason felt the world tilt beneath him. Catherine's granddaughter. But that would mean Catherine had married, had children. "She never told anyone," Eliza continued, seeming to gather her thoughts with visible effort. "Not until she was dying. She made me promise to find you." Mason's heart thundered in his chest. "Find me for what purpose?" Eliza's gaze held his with surprising strength for someone who had been at death's door hours earlier. "Because you're my grandfather." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and world-changing. Mason felt as though he'd been struck by lightning, every certainty in his carefully constructed life suddenly thrown into chaos. "That's not possible," he said automatically, even as his mind raced back through time, calculating dates, remembering his final weeks with Catherine before she'd left without explanation. "She was already pregnant when she left," Eliza said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "She never told you. Never told anyone, not even my mother. She kept your photograph all these years." Mason stood abruptly, needing space, air, distance from this revelation. He moved to the window, staring out at the blizzard still raging beyond the glass. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shock, disbelief, anger, grief, and beneath it all, a terrible sense of loss for the years that could have been. Behind him, he heard Eliza shift in the bed. "I shouldn't have come," she said, her voice thick, with emotion. "Not like this, not during the storm, but I needed to find you before—" She broke off and Mason turned to face her again. "Before what?" Eliza met his gaze directly. And in that moment, Mason couldn't deny the truth he saw written in her features, his own eyes looking back at him from Catherine's face. "Before it was too late," she finished simply. Outside, the wind howled with undiminished fury, but inside the cabin, time seemed suspended between heartbeats. Two strangers, connected by blood and separated by decades of secrets, stood at the precipice of a truth that would forever alter both their lives, a truth as wild and unforgiving as the blizzard that had brought them together. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the relentless howl of the wind outside. Mason stood frozen by the window, his weathered face unreadable as he processed Eliza's revelation. The wolf dogs sensed the tension, their yellow eyes shifting between the two humans with quiet attentiveness. Eliza tried to sit up more fully, wincing as pain shot through her right arm, a reminder of the crash that had nearly cost her life. "I know this is a shock," she said softly. "It was for me, too." Mason's gaze remained fixed on the window, though he wasn't seeing the blizzard beyond the glass. Instead, his mind had traveled back 33 years to that final summer with Catherine Sullivan. They had been so young. He was 25, she 23. He had already committed to the solitary life in these mountains, following in his father's footsteps as a trapper and wilderness guide. Catherine had come to the area for a summer job at the ranger station, a temporary position before starting graduate school in the fall. Their connection had been immediate and intense. For 3 months, they'd been inseparable whenever her work schedule allowed. Catherine had been fascinated by his lifestyle, his knowledge of the wilderness, his self-reliance. He'd been captivated by her intelligence, her laugh, her way of seeing beauty in the smallest details of the natural world. When she'd left in late August, they'd made no promises. Mason had assumed she would return the following summer, but she never did. No letters, no calls. He'd gone to the ranger station once, but they'd had no forwarding contact information. In those pre-internet days, people could disappear completely. If they wanted to, and he'd eventually accepted that she had moved on with her life. Never once had he imagined she'd been carrying his child. Mason finally turned to face Eliza. "Your mother," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She would have been born January 1994, Eliza confirmed. Her name was Sarah." The past tense didn't escape Mason's notice. "Was?" Eliza's eyes clouded with grief. "She died when I was 17. Car accident. Drunk driver." Mason absorbed this blow silently, feeling the loss of a daughter he'd never known and would never have the chance to meet. His hands clenched, involuntarily at his sides. "And Catherine?" he asked, afraid of the answer but needing to know. "Grandmother passed 8 months ago," Eliza said gently. "Pancreatic cancer. It was quick at the end." She paused, swallowing hard. "That's when she told me about you. She made me promise to find you, to tell you the truth." Mason moved to the wood stove, mechanically adding another log, needing something physical to occupy his hands. The wolf dogs watched him attentively, sensing his distress. "Why now?" he asked, more to himself than to Eliza. "After all these years, why tell you now?" Eliza's voice was steady despite her weakened condition. "She said she'd made a terrible mistake, that she thought she was doing the right thing, protecting you from a responsibility you hadn't asked for. She knew how much this life meant to you." She gestured weakly at the cabin around them. "She didn't want to force you to choose." "That wasn't her choice to make," Mason said, a flash of anger breaking through his shock. "I know," Eliza agreed, quietly. "She knew it too in the end. She regretted it every day of her life." Mason returned to the chair beside the bed, sinking into it heavily. He studied Eliza's face, seeing clearly now what he should have recognized immediately. The echoes of his own features blended with Catherine's. His granddaughter. The concept was still too enormous to fully comprehend. "You took quite a risk coming out here in this weather," he said finally. A ghost of a smile touched Eliza's lips. Stubbornness runs in the family, apparently. Despite himself, Mason felt an answering smile tug at his mouth. It was true. He'd always been obstinate to a fault, pursuing his own path regardless of what others thought prudent. "The storm's not letting up," he said, nodding toward the window. "We're stuck here until it passes, which won't be until tomorrow at the earliest. You should rest more. Your body's been through a serious trauma." Eliza didn't argue, her eyelids already growing heavy. The emotional exertion on top of her physical ordeal had depleted what little energy she'd recovered. "Will you be here?" she asked, her voice fading. "When will I wake up?" Something twisted in Mason's chest at the vulnerability in the question. "I'll be here," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." As Eliza drifted back to sleep, Mason remained in the chair, watching over her. The silver locket lay open on the quilt between them, photographing a window to a past that suddenly had new meaning. Morning came with little change in the weather. The blizzard had settled into a steady, heavy snowfall, accumulating rapidly. Outside the cabin windows, Mason had dozed intermittently through the night, waking frequently to check on Eliza and maintain the fire. Around dawn, he'd made a pot of strong coffee and was sipping it thoughtfully when Eliza stirred again. She woke more coherently this time, grimacing as she tested her injured arm. "Good morning," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. "Morning," Mason replied, setting down his coffee mug. "How are you feeling?" "Like I rolled down a mountain in a jeep and nearly froze to death," she said dryly. "But better than I have any right to be, thanks to you." Mason nodded toward the window. "The storm's still bad, but I've radioed that you're safe. When it clears, we can get you proper medical attention for that arm." "It's not broken," Eliza said with the certainty of someone who'd experienced broken bones before. "Just badly bruised, maybe sprained." Mason rose and moved to a cabinet, retrieving a first aid kit far more comprehensive than the typical household variety. "Let me have a look anyway." With gentle efficiency that belied his rugged appearance, Mason examined her injured arm, confirming her assessment. He wrapped it in a proper support bandage and provided painkillers from his medical supplies. "You're well prepared," Eliza observed, looking around the cabin with new awareness. "When you live this far from help, you learn to handle most situations yourself," Mason replied. He paused, then asked, "Are you hungry? I can make breakfast." Eliza nodded gratefully. "Starving, actually." Mason set about preparing a hearty meal. Sourdough, pancakes from his own starter, strips of venison bacon, and strong black tea with honey. He worked with practiced movements in the small kitchen area, aware of Eliza's eyes following him. "How long have you lived here?" she asked as he cooked. "Built this place in the summer of '91, Mason answered. "Been here ever since, except for supply runs to town every few months." "Alone." Mason glanced at the wolf dogs, who had settled near Eliza's bed. "Not entirely." He brought the food to her on a tray, helping her sit up against the pillows before taking his own plate to the chair beside the bed. They ate in silence for several minutes, the simple act of sharing a meal creating a tentative bridge across the decades of separation. "Why did you come looking for me?" Mason asked finally, setting his empty plate aside. "Beyond fulfilling a promise to Catherine." Eliza met his gaze directly. "Because you're the only family I have left. And because I needed answers." "What kind of answers?" Tanner shook his head. "Just me and dispatch. I came myself because of our history. Figured you'd want this handled quietly." Mason nodded, grateful for the sheriff's discretion. They'd known each other for 15 years, ever since Tanner had. There'd been a rookie deputy who'd gotten lost in the mountains during a search operation. Mason had found him half frozen and guided him to safety. There had been mutual respect between them ever since. "What do they want with her?" Mason asked. "Don't know the details," Tanner admitted, "but the agent who put out the alert is on his way to Pinewood Ridge. He'll be there by morning, road conditions permitting." Mason processed this information, instinctively wary of federal involvement. "Thanks for the heads up." Tanner studied him for a moment. "You're planning something. What is it?" "Nothing illegal," Mason assured him. "Just need time to figure things out." The sheriff sighed. "I didn't see you today. Couldn't make it through the snow. Radio communication was spotty. Understood?" Mason nodded, grateful for the reprieve. "Understood." As Tanner turned to leave, he added, "Whatever you're planning, be careful. These aren't local matters we're dealing with." After the sheriff departed, Mason remained on the porch, watching the snowmobile disappear back into the trees. The peaceful isolation of his mountain sanctuary had been breached not once, but twice today. First by a granddaughter he never knew existed, and now by the shadowy complications of a world he'd long ago left behind. He turned back toward the cabin door, knowing that inside waited a young woman who was now far more than just Catherine's granddaughter or a stranger he'd rescued from the storm. She was someone in danger, someone with secrets, and somehow through the twisted paths of fate, she had become his responsibility. The afternoon light was already fading, the short winter day surrendering to an early dusk. Mason took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, steeling himself for what was to come. Whatever trouble followed Eliza Winters, it had now found its way to his doorstep. And Mason Reed had never been one to turn away from a fight, especially not when family was involved, even family he'd only just discovered. With newfound resolve, he reached for the cabin door. The time for revelations and reminiscence was over. Now they needed a plan. Mason stepped back into the cabin, stomping snow from his boots. Eliza watched him from the bed, her expression alert despite her weakened state. "What's wrong?" she asked. Immediately, reading the tension in his shoulders, Mason crossed to the wood stove, warming his hands while gathering his thoughts. He'd never been one to soften difficult truths. That was Sheriff Tanner. The FBI is looking for you. The color drained from Eliza's face. Her fingers instinctively sought the locket, clutching it like a talisman. How did they find me? They haven't. Not yet, Mason clarified. When I radioed in about finding you, your name triggered an alert in their system. Tanner came to warn me. Eliza closed her eyes briefly, her chest rising and falling with a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was resignation rather than surprise in her gaze. I was afraid of this. Mason pulled his chair closer to the bed, his voice low and steady. I think it's time you told me the whole story, not just about Catherine and your search for me, about why federal agents are interested in Eliza Winters. For a long moment, Eliza was silent, seemingly weighing her options. The wolf dogs watched her with their uncanny attentiveness, sensing the gravity of the moment. I worked for Morgan Reese Technologies, she finally began. Cutting-edge research and development, primarily government contracts. I was a project manager in their sustainable energy division. Mason listened without interruption as she continued, explaining how she'd discovered irregularities in the company's testing data for a new power cell technology, manipulated results that masked critical safety flaws. The technology wasn't ready, but the company was pushing to fast-track it for military applications, Eliza explained. When I raised concerns internally, I was shut down. When I pushed harder, I was transferred to an unrelated division. When I wouldn't let it go, she trailed off, her expression hardening. They came after you, Mason finished for her. Eliza nodded. At first it was subtle. Security escorts in the building, random audits of my work. Then my apartment was broken into nothing taken, just disturbed, a warning. She shifted against the pillows, wincing as the movement jarred her injured arm. When grandmother died and left me the locket, it felt like a sign. I could disappear for a while, claiming personal leave to handle her estate and use the time to find you. 2 birds, 1 stone. But they followed you, Mason surmised. I thought I'd been careful, Eliza admitted. Changed vehicles 3 times, paid cash, used back roads. But yes, I believe someone followed me. The crash. She stopped, her brow furrowing. I saw headlights behind me on that mountain road. They were gaining fast, despite the conditions. Then they were gone. And moments later, I encountered that fallen tree. Mason's jaw tightened. What he'd assumed was an unfortunate accident now appeared to be attempted murder, disguised as a tragic mishap in a blizzard. Someone had run Eliza off the road and left her to die. The sheriff said the FBI wants you in protective custody, he told her. An agent is arriving in Pinewood Ridge tomorrow. That depends on which branch of the FBI, Eliza said carefully. And which agent? Mason caught her meaning immediately. In the shadowy intersections of government and powerful private interests, badges didn't always guarantee allegiance to justice. He'd been away from civilization for decades, but he wasn't naive. You don't trust them, he stated. I don't know who to trust, Eliza corrected. Morgan Reese has deep government connections. Military contracts worth billions. They could have people anywhere. Mason rose, moving to a window where he could scan the area surrounding the cabin, more from habit than immediate concern. The snow had stopped falling, but heavy clouds lingered, promising more before the system cleared. Drifts had piled high. Around the cabin, some nearly reaching the windowsills. We have until tomorrow morning at the earliest, he said, calculating. The main roads might be partially cleared by then, but the access road to my property won't be touched. Only snowmobiles or sleds could make it through right now. What are you thinking? Eliza asked. Mason turned to face her. Sheriff Tanner gave us a head start. As far as the FBI knows, you haven't been found yet. We can use that. A spark of hope lit Eliza's eyes. To do what? to get you somewhere safe until we figure out who to trust." Mason moved to a trunk at the foot of his bed and opened it, revealing neatly organized survival gear. "But first, we need evidence, something concrete, that proves what Morgan Reese is doing." Eliza's expression shifted to one of uncertainty. "I tried that. Any digital files I had were on my laptop, which is probably buried in the snow with my Jeep if it wasn't destroyed in the crash." Mason paused in his inventory of supplies. "Where exactly did you go off the road?" "About 10 miles back, just after turning onto the logging road. There's a sharp bend with a ravine on the right side. That's where I went over." Mason nodded, his mind working through calculations of time, distance, and risk. If the Jeep's there, there's a chance the laptop survived. Electronic devices can endure more than people think, especially in the cold. "You want to go back for it?" Eliza realized, alarm crossing her features. "In this weather, it's too dangerous." "Not if you know the terrain," Mason countered. "And not if you have the right equipment." He gestured to the organized gear in the trunk. "I know these mountains better than anyone, and we have advantages they don't." He glanced meaningfully at Ash and Timber, who had risen at the shift in energy within the cabin. The wolf dogs were more than companions. They were extensions of Mason's senses in the wilderness, capable of detecting approaching humans long before they came within visual range. "You're not in any condition to travel," Mason continued, eyeing Eliza's injured arm and still recovering state. "But that works to our advantage. Anyone searching will expect us both to be here." Understanding dawned in Eliza's eyes. "A diversion." Mason nodded. "Exactly. I'll retrieve the laptop while you remain here as the visible target. If anyone approaches while I'm gone, Timber will stay with you. His alarm will give you time to use this." He reached above the fireplace, removing an old but well-maintained lever-action rifle from wall mounts. Eliza eyed the weapon with a mixture of respect and hesitation. "I haven't fired a gun since I was a teenager. Dad used to take me target shooting sometimes." "It's simple," Mason said, checking the action before placing it within her reach. "Lever down, lever up, squeeze. 7 rounds, all loaded. But it's just a precaution. Timber will warn you long before anyone gets close enough to be a threat." He continued preparations with methodical efficiency, gathering essential gear into a specialized pack designed for winter travel. Additional layers, emergency supplies, tools for extracting items from the crashed vehicle, and a small but powerful hatchet that could serve as both tool and weapon if necessary. "What if you run into whoever followed me?" Eliza asked, watching him work. "You'd be outnumbered." A grim smile flickered across Mason's weathered face. "City people in the wilderness aren't in their element. I am." He selected a hunting knife, with a 10-inch blade, securing it to his belt. "Besides, they'll be looking for a direct approach along the roads. I'll be taking paths they won't expect." As darkness fell, Mason finalized his preparations. He'd fixed a hearty meal for them, both, knowing Eliza needed to rebuild her strength, and he would need the energy for the journey ahead. They ate mostly in silence, the gravity of the situation weighing on them. "I still don't understand why you're doing this," Eliza said finally, setting aside her empty bowl. "You only just learned of my existence. You don't owe me this kind of risk." Mason's hands stilled as he packed the last of his supplies. Without looking up, he said quietly, "I wasn't there for Catherine, or for your mother." He secured the pack with a final adjustment of the straps. "But I'm here now, and your family." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, powerful in its unembellished honesty. Mason had lived a solitary life, by choice, but that didn't mean he didn't understand the obligations of blood. "I'll leave before dawn," he continued, all business again. "Should reach the crash site by mid-morning if the weather holds. Back here by late afternoon." Eliza nodded, accepting his decision, despite her concerns. If the laptop is still functional, the files are encrypted. Password is Bitterroot 1993, grandmother's reference to the summer she spent here. Something shifted in Mason's expression at this reminder of Catherine, but he simply nodded and committed the password to memory. As the evening deepened into night, Mason showed Eliza the basic operations of the cabin: how to maintain the wood stove, where essential supplies were kept, how to use the satellite radio in an emergency. Though she was still weak, she absorbed the instructions with quick intelligence. "Try to rest," Mason advised as he settled into the chair beside the bed, intending to catch a few hours of sleep before his pre-dawn departure. "Timber will stay at the door tonight. Nothing gets past him." The wolf dog in question moved to take up his position by the entrance, yellow eyes alert despite the late hour. His companion, Ash, would accompany Mason on tomorrow's mission. "What if they come before you get back?" Eliza asked quietly, the unspoken fear finally finding voice. Mason met her gaze steadily. "Then you buy time. Radio Sheriff Tanner directly on the emergency channel. He'll come. And remember, these mountains have kept me safe for decades. They'll do the same for you." With those words of reassurance, he dimmed the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by the orange glow from the wood stove's vents. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, the deep quiet of a wilderness blanketed in fresh snow. Morning arrived with steel-gray skies and temperatures well below freezing. Mason rose silently in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with practiced quiet to avoid waking Eliza. He donned his winter gear methodically, layers designed to manage moisture and maintain core temperature in the harsh conditions. Ash watched attentively as Mason performed his final equipment. Check. The wolf dog would serve as both companion and protector on the journey, his senses far keener than any human's for detecting potential threats. Before departing, Mason left a note beside Eliza's bed with additional instructions and reminders. Then, with a final glance at his sleeping granddaughter, he slipped out of the cabin with Ash at his heels. The world outside was transformed. The storm had deposited over 3 feet of fresh powder, creating an alien landscape of smooth contours and deep shadows in the dim pre-dawn light. Mason strapped on specialized backcountry skis, wider and shorter than traditional cross-country equipment, designed for navigating unpacked snow. With Ash breaking trail ahead, Mason set out, his breath forming dense clouds in the frigid air. He traveled light but prepared, every item in his pack serving multiple essential functions. The route he'd chosen would take him along ridgelines, where the wind had scoured away some of the deeper snow, making travel more efficient. As the sun crested the eastern mountains, casting long blue shadows across the pristine landscape, Mason paused to check his bearings. The crashed jeep should be approximately 4 miles ahead, down in the ravine alongside the logging road. From his current position on the ridge, he could see sections of the road below, still completely impassable to conventional vehicles. Just as he was about to continue, Ash froze, head raised and ears pricked forward. Mason immediately dropped to a crouch, scanning the terrain below. The wolf dog's posture wasn't one of alarm, but of focused attention. Following Ash's gaze, Mason spotted what had caught the animal's notice: movement along the logging road to the west. He removed compact binoculars from his jacket pocket and focused on the area, 2 snowmobiles moving slowly eastward toward the cabin. The riders wore dark winter gear, their faces obscured by helmets and masks. Nothing identifying, but everything about their careful pace and alertness suggested they weren't local search and rescue. Mason's jaw tightened. They'd arrived sooner than expected, likely having traveled through the night once the snowfall diminished. Sheriff Tanner's warning had given them precious hours, but not as many as he'd hoped. His first instinct was to turn back, to protect Eliza. But tactical assessment overrode emotion. The intruders were still at least an hour from reaching the cabin, moving cautiously to avoid detection. If he abandoned his mission now, they'd lose their only chance at obtaining evidence that might keep Eliza safe in the long term. And Timber was with her. The wolf dog would give ample warning before any threat reached the cabin doors. Decision made, Mason continued eastward along the ridge, increasing his pace. The snowmobiles would need to follow the winding road. His more direct route across country would allow him to complete his mission and potentially return before they discovered Eliza's presence. An hour later, Mason reached the area where Eliza had described going off the road. From his vantage point, above, he could see the damaged section of guardrail where the jeep had broken through and the disturbed snow pattern of its violent descent into the ravine below. With careful, controlled movements, Mason navigated the steep slope using trees and rock outcroppings as anchors where possible. Ash bounded alongside him, instinctively finding the safest path through the treacherous terrain. At the bottom of the ravine, the jeep lay half buried in snow, resting on its side just as Eliza had described. Mason approached cautiously, alert for any signs of instability. The vehicle appeared to have been partially uncovered at some point, evidence that whoever had followed Eliza had checked to confirm her fate. But they'd been interrupted or satisfied by what they saw, as they hadn't. Completely excavated the wreck, Mason cleared snow from the passenger side door, now facing upward, and carefully pulled it open. The interior was a chaos of deployed airbags, scattered items, and broken glass, all dusted with snow that had blown in through shattered windows. He worked methodically, searching the cabin for Eliza's laptop. He found it wedged beneath the front passenger seat, a slim silver device in a protective case. Remarkably, it appeared intact, though whether it would function after exposure to the elements remained to be seen. Mason secured it in his pack and continued searching, gathering anything else that might be useful. Eliza's phone, her full backpack with additional clothing and supplies, and a small external hard drive found in a hidden compartment beneath. The jeep's rear carpet. As he worked, Ash suddenly tensed, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Mason immediately stopped listening. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, he could hear the faint buzz of snowmobile engines growing louder. They were coming this way. Mason quickly finished his salvage operation, securing the items in his pack before retreating from the jeep. He needed to leave the ravine immediately. It was a natural trap with limited escape routes. But climbing back up the steep slope would leave him exposed and vulnerable during the ascent. Instead, he chose to follow the ravine eastward, away from the approaching engines. The narrow gully would provide cover while leading toward a broader valley that offered multiple exit routes to higher ground. With Ash leading the way, Mason moved swiftly through the knee-deep snow, staying close to the ravine wall where overhanging vegetation provided additional concealment from above. The sound of engines grew louder, then stopped. They'd reached the point where the jeep had gone over the edge. Mason continued forward, putting distance between himself and the crash site while remaining invisible from the road above. He'd traveled, perhaps a quarter mile, when Ash suddenly stopped, hackles raised, staring back the way they'd come. Mason froze, listening intently. Voices carried in the cold air, muffled but audible. Two men, maybe three, discussing the jeep and whether to descend to inspect it again. Then a new sound, the crackle of radio communication. Site located, vehicle appears abandoned, proceeding to the target location. Mason's blood chilled at the clinical detachment in the voice. These weren't law enforcement officers concerned with a missing person. Their tone and terminology suggested military or paramilitary operation. The engines started again, moving away, continuing toward his cabin, toward Eliza. Mason checked his watch. Nearly noon. He was hours away from returning, via his original route, But now that route was compromised, with hostiles between him and the cabin. He needed a new plan, and quickly he studied the terrain ahead. The ravine he followed eventually joined a larger valley with a seasonal creek, currently frozen and snow-covered. Following that creek would lead him to the eastern approach to his property, a longer route, but one the snowmobiles couldn't access due to dense forest and rocky terrain. Mason set off at the fastest pace he could safely maintain. The laptop weighed heavily in his pack, not just physically, but with the knowledge that it might contain the only evidence that could save Eliza from those who wanted her silenced. As he traveled, his mind worked through scenarios and contingencies. The attackers had a significant head start and motorized transport. They would reach the cabin well before he could return. Eliza was still recovering, limited in her mobility. And while timber would provide warning and some protection, the wolf dog alone couldn't stop determined, armed intruders. Their only advantage was that the attackers might not know for certain that Eliza had survived and reached the cabin. They were checking the jeep first, following a logical progression in their search. That might buy precious minutes of uncertainty when they first approached the property. The sun had passed its zenith and was descending toward the western mountains. When Mason paused at a vantage point overlooking the valley, his cabin occupied. Through his binoculars, he could see the snowmobiles parked at the edge of his clearing, concealed from direct view of the cabin by a stand of pines, but revealing their position to him on the ridge above. Two figures in dark winter gear were conducting a careful perimeter assessment, moving with the disciplined precision of military or specialized law enforcement. A third remained with the vehicles, likely coordinating with others via radio. Of Eliza and Timber, there was no sign. The cabin appeared undisturbed, smoke rising normally from the chimney as if it were any ordinary day. Mason studied the tactical situation with the calculating eye of a hunter. Direct approach would be suicide. They had superior numbers and likely superior firepower. His advantage lay in the terrain and in their unfamiliarity with it. These men, professional as they appeared, were operating outside their element. With grim determination, Mason adjusted his pack and signaled to Ash. They wouldn't be returning to the cabin, not directly, not yet. First, they would need to even the odds. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Mason Reed disappeared into the forest, becoming once more what he had always been in these mountains. A ghost, a shadow, a predator moving silently through terrain where others were merely prey, and for the first time in decades, he was hunting men. Eliza had awakened to an empty cabin and Mason's handwritten note. His precise instructions were clear. Stay inside, keep the fire maintained, use the rifle only if absolutely necessary, and trust Timber's warnings. The wolf dog had taken his assignment seriously, positioning himself by the front window where he could monitor the approach to the cabin while remaining hidden from outside view. For hours, Eliza had occupied herself by studying the cabin's interior in daylight, gaining insights into Mason's solitary life through his possessions. Handcrafted furniture spoke of patience and craftsmanship. Bookshelves held volumes on wilderness survival, wolf behavior, native plants, and surprisingly, quantum physics and philosophy. A collection of intricate wood carvings, mostly animals, revealed an artistic side to the rugged trapper. As midday approached, Eliza had just finished changing her arm bandage when Timber suddenly lifted his head, ears forward. A low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest. Eliza froze, listening. Nothing yet, but Timber's senses far exceeded human capability. Moving carefully to avoid jarring her injured arm, she retrieved the rifle Mason had left her and checked that it was loaded as he'd shown her. "What is it, boy?" she whispered to Timber, who had risen to his feet, hackles slightly raised. The wolf dog moved silently to the door, pressing his nose to the crack at the bottom, scenting the air. His body language shifted from alert to tense. A threatening presence had been detected. Heart hammering, Eliza peered cautiously through a side window, careful to remain hidden behind the curtain. At first, she saw nothing in the snow-covered clearing before the cabin. Then a movement caught her eye, a dark figure slipping between trees at the perimeter, approximately 100 yards out. A second figure appeared briefly before vanishing. Behind a stand of pines, they had found her. Timber's growl deepened, though still barely audible, a warning meant for her alone. They were being surrounded, approached from multiple angles. Eliza's mind raced. Mason wouldn't return for hours yet. The satellite radio was her only communication option, but using it would confirm her presence to anyone monitoring frequencies. Better to maintain the element of uncertainty. Let them wonder if the cabin was occupied. Moving silently, she gathered essential supplies into a small pack: water, energy bars, matches, the extra ammunition Mason had left. The silver locket went around her neck, tucked securely beneath her layers. Timber watched her preparations, seeming to understand. When she approached the back of the cabin, he padded alongside her to what appeared to be a solid wall. Following Mason's written instructions, Eliza located a concealed latch behind a mounted rack of trapping tools. It released a nearly invisible door, a hunter's exit designed to allow silent departure when game approached from the main entrance. The narrow passage led to a small covered porch at the rear of the cabin, shielded from view by dense pines. From here, a path barely visible beneath the fresh snow led upward toward rocky terrain that would be difficult to approach unseen. A strategic escape route built into the cabin's very design. Eliza stepped out cautiously, Timber at her side. The bitter cold hit her immediately, her breath clouding before her face. The wolf dog took the lead, breaking trail through snow that reached mid-calf. They had traveled perhaps 50 yards upslope when a sound sliced through the winter stillness. The cabin door being forced open. Eliza ducked behind a large pine, clutching the rifle. Below, she could see two figures in tactical winter gear entering the cabin, weapons drawn. A third remained outside, scanning the surroundings. Timber pressed against her leg, silent but vigilant. Eliza understood his message as clearly as spoken words. Keep moving, quietly, now. They continued upward, using trees and rock formations for cover, leaving as little trail as possible in the crusty snow. Eliza's injured arm throbbed with each step, but fear and determination pushed her forward. Mason's note had mentioned a fallback position, a natural cave in the ridgeline above the cabin, stocked with emergency supplies. If she could reach it, she might have a defensible position until Mason returned. Behind them, a shout echoed through the trees. They discovered the rear exit. The hunt was on. Miles away, Mason Reed moved like a shadow through terrain he knew intimately. Having observed the three intruders from his ridge vantage point, he had formulated his strategy: direct confrontation against superior numbers, and firepower would be suicide. Instead, he would use the environment itself as a weapon. He left Ash at a concealed position overlooking the approach to his property, with a specific command that the wolf dog understood from years of training: watch and warn, but remain hidden. Then Mason circled wide around his cabin, moving through dense forest where snowmobiles couldn't follow. His first target was the vehicles themselves. Reaching the snowmobiles unseen, he worked with swift efficiency. A few strategic adjustments to the engines, untraceable once discovered, would ensure they wouldn't start when needed. Next, he disabled their communications equipment, removing key components and pocketing them. Just as he finished, Ash's distant signal reached him, a single distinctive howl that meant movement detected. The men were returning to the vehicles. Mason melted into the forest, using a game trail to gain distance unseen. Through his binoculars, he observed two of the men emerging from the direction of his cabin. Their body language told him everything. He needed to know the aggressive forward posture, weapons at ready position. They had found evidence of occupancy, but not their target. The third man spoke into a radio, received no response, then checked the equipment. His frustrated gestures confirmed Mason's sabotage had been effective. After a brief discussion, 2 of the men mounted the snowmobiles, while the third disappeared back toward the cabin, likely to continue the search there. When the engines failed to start, the men's disciplined demeanor cracked slightly. One kicked his machine in frustration before both began basic troubleshooting. Mason knew they'd find nothing obviously wrong. His sabotage had been too subtle for quick field repair. This development bought precious time, but also created a new problem. With their transportation disabled, the men would be forced to remain in the area longer. They would become more desperate, more dangerous. Mason signaled Ash to join him, and together they worked their way through the forest toward the rear of his property. If Eliza had followed his instructions, she would have used the hunter's exit and headed for the ridge cave. He needed to find her before the intruders did. Halfway up the slope, Ash suddenly froze, nose to the ground. Mason knelt beside him, examining what had caught the wolf dog's attention. Faint impressions in the snow, partially filled by recent wind drift, but still discernible to experienced eyes. 2 sets of tracks, human and canine. Eliza and Timber had passed this way, perhaps an hour earlier. Mason felt a surge of pride. Despite her injured state and urban background, his granddaughter had the survival instincts of her bloodline. She had evaded immediate capture and was following his contingency plan. But the tracks told another story too, a third set, human, following the same path more recently. One of the intruders had discovered their trail. Mason's expression hardened. The hunter had become prey, unaware that a more dangerous predator now tracked him from behind. Eliza's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself up the increasingly steep terrain. The ridge cave should be close now, if she'd followed Mason's directions correctly. Her injured arm had become a liability, nearly useless except as a counterbalance. The rifle slung across her back felt heavier with each step. Timber remained. Close, occasionally looking back the way they'd come. His behavior had grown increasingly tense over the past 15 minutes. Their pursuer was gaining ground. A sound from below confirmed this fear, a branch snapping under careless weight. Eliza ducked behind a boulder, pressing herself against the cold stone as she fought to control her breathing. Timber flattened beside her, utterly silent, yellow eyes fixed on the forest below. Through gaps in the trees, she caught glimpses of a figure ascending the same path they'd taken. Male, average height, moving with military precision despite the difficult terrain. The winter gear obscured his features, but the tactical nature of his equipment and his methodical movement pattern suggested professional training. He paused periodically to study the trail, never doubting his direction. He was perhaps 200 yards below her position and closing the gap with unsettling efficiency. Eliza weighed her options. Continuing upward would leave an obvious trail, and her stamina was fading. Making a stand here offered better concealment, but no escape route if things went badly. The rifle provided some advantage, but she had no illusions about her marksmanship against what was likely a trained operative. Timber made the decision for her, nudging her arm and then moving laterally along the ridge rather than continuing upward. Eliza followed, trusting the wolf dog's instincts. They traversed a narrow ledge, using rock outcroppings for handholds. This path left minimal tracks, an advantage on the wind-scoured stone. After 100 yards of precarious travel, Timber led her into a narrow crevice between massive boulders. The opening, barely visible unless directly in front of it, widened into a natural chimney that led upward. Eliza understood immediately. This was an alternate approach to the cave, one that wouldn't be obvious to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. The climb was challenging with her injured arm, but the natural chimney provided ample handholds and footholds. Timber scrambled up with ease, waiting at intervals to ensure she followed. Finally, the chimney opened onto a small plateau, and Eliza saw what had been their destination all along, a dark opening in the ridge face, partially concealed by wind-twisted pines. The cave entrance was low, requiring her to duck to enter. Inside, the space widened considerably, extending perhaps 20 feet into the mountain. Light filtered through the entrance, illuminating the essentials Mason had cached there: a sealed container of emergency supplies, a small propane heater, jugs of water, and a more substantial weapons case than she had expected. Eliza collapsed against the cave wall, exhaustion temporarily overwhelming her. Timber remained at the entrance, alert and watchful. They had reached relative safety, but their pursuer was still out there, and she had no way of knowing when or if Mason would return. Her reprieve was short-lived. Timber's posture changed suddenly, his attention fixed on something beyond the cave entrance. Eliza forced herself to her feet, retrieving the rifle. Remaining inside the cave would trap her if discovered. Better to use the high ground advantage of the plateau while she still could. She crept to the edge of the plateau, staying low, and surveyed the slope below. At first, she saw nothing. Then movement caught her eye. Their pursuer had abandoned the original trail and was now working his way directly up the steepest part of the ridge, scaling rock faces with practiced skill. He had somehow intuited their direction change and was cutting the distance rapidly. Eliza positioned herself behind a boulder, steadying the rifle against the rock. The range was approximately 100 yards, a difficult shot for an amateur under ideal conditions, nearly impossible with an injured arm and the stress of the situation. She had one advantage: he didn't know he'd been spotted. His focus was on his climb, not on potential threats from above. Eliza lined up the shot as best she could, aiming for the center mass as her father had taught her years ago. Her finger tensed on the trigger, but hesitation stayed the final pressure. Taking a human life, even in self-defense, was a threshold she wasn't certain she could cross. In that moment of uncertainty, the decision was taken from her. A shadow detached itself from the forest edge below, moving with such speed and purpose that Eliza barely registered what was happening. The pursuer sensed the threat too late. He turned, reaching for his sidearm, but was driven backward by the impact of a large, dark form. Mason Reed had entered the equation. Mason had tracked the intruder for nearly a mile, always staying just far enough behind to remain undetected. When the man changed course, beginning a direct ascent up the ridge face, Mason recognized the tactical shift immediately. The hunter had spotted a sign of his quarry. That meant Eliza was somewhere above, likely near or in the ridge cave, and this operative was closing in rapidly. Mason made his decision. Stealth had served its purpose. Now speed was essential. Shedding his pack to increase mobility, he kept only his hunting knife and a length of high-strength cord. Using a parallel approach, he gained ground rapidly, his lifetime in these mountains evident in every sure-footed step. When he burst from the tree line, the intruder was mid-climb, perhaps 75 yards up the ridge. Mason covered the intervening ground in a controlled rush, timing his approach to coincide with the man's focus on a difficult section of the ascent. The operative sensed the attack too late. He just secured a handhold when Mason struck, driving into him with controlled force, targeting specific pressure points that temporarily paralyzed the right arm and disrupted balance. Years of taking down wounded predators had taught Mason precisely how to neutralize a larger opponent's advantages. They tumbled together down a short scree slope, Mason absorbing the impact with practiced rolls while maintaining his grip on his opponent. When they came to rest against a boulder, Mason had already established position dominance, pinning the man with a knee across the throat. Not enough pressure to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to demonstrate complete control. "Federal agent," the man gasped, reaching for identification with his left hand. "You're interfering with—" "Save it," Mason interrupted, increasing knee pressure slightly. "Federal agents don't run people off roads in blizzards and leave them to die." With practiced efficiency, he used the cord to secure the man's wrists, then methodically disarmed him. A primary sidearm, a backup ankle weapon, 2 knives, and a garrote wire concealed in what appeared to be an ordinary watch band. Only, after the man was fully restrained, did Mason search his pockets, retrieving identification and communications devices. The ID showed FBI credentials for one Thomas Mercer, special agent. It looked authentic, but Mason had limited means to verify it in the field. "Who sent you?" Mason demanded, keeping his voice low. Mercer maintained operational discipline, offering only name, rank, and agency, the standard response of legitimate personnel when compromised. Mason wasn't convinced. He'd spent enough time around genuine federal wildlife agents to recognize the subtle distinctions in training and demeanor. "The woman," Mason pressed. "What's your interest in her?" "Protective custody," Mercer responded. "She's a witness in an ongoing federal investigation. We're here to ensure her safety by tracking her through a blizzard and saying nothing when she went off the road." Mason's tone remained conversational, but his grip on the hunting knife tightened perceptibly. "Try again." Before Mercer could respond, movement from above caught Mason's attention. Timber was descending the ridge, with Eliza following more cautiously behind. The wolf dog reached them first, circling the restrained man with obvious aggression before positioning himself at Mason's side. "Are you hurt?" Mason called to Eliza, not taking his eyes off his prisoner. "I'm okay," she replied, making her way carefully down the slope, rifle still in hand. "Who is he?" "Claims to be FBI," Mason answered. "Sent to protect you, apparently." Eliza's expression hardened as she approached. "Let me see his ID." Mason handed her the credentials, which she examined carefully. "This looks real," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean his intentions are. Morgan Reese has connections throughout federal agencies." Mercer looked between them, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "You're making a serious mistake. There are 2 more agents nearby. When I don't report in, they'll call for backup." "No, they won't," Mason said calmly. "Their comms are disabled, as are their vehicles. They're just as isolated as we are for the moment." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Mercer's face. "You know who I am," Eliza said, crouching to meet the agent's eyes. "Why don't you tell us who you really work for? The actual FBI or Morgan Reese's security division?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Mercer maintained. "We received intelligence that you were in danger from Morgan Reese operatives. My team was dispatched to locate and secure you before they could." Eliza's laugh held no humor. "And I'm supposed to believe that the timing of your arrival, directly after I was forced off the road, is coincidence." "We've been tracking you since you left Helena," Mercer admitted. "We lost you in the storm, then picked up your trail again when the weather cleared. We found the Jeep this morning but couldn't tell if you'd survived. When we detected smoke from this cabin, we approached to investigate." Mason and Eliza exchanged glances, silently evaluating the story. It was plausible, but something felt off, a disconnect between the words and the tactical approach they'd observed. "If you're legitimate, why not announce yourselves?" Mason challenged. "Why the perimeter sweep with weapons drawn?" "Standard procedure when approaching an unknown situation," Mercer responded automatically. "We had reason to believe Morgan Reese operatives might have reached you first." Mason's expression remained skeptical. 3 decades of reading animal behavior had made him exceptionally attuned to subtle signs of deception in humans as well. This man was practiced, but tells were still present, micro-expressions that didn't align with his narrative. "The laptop," Mason said suddenly. "From the Jeep. What's on it?" Mercer's momentary hesitation was all the confirmation they needed. "Testing data," Eliza supplied, watching the agent's reaction closely. "Proof that Morgan Reese falsified safety reports on their new power cell technology. Documented evidence that they knew about catastrophic failure risks and covered them up to secure military contracts." Something shifted in Mercer's eyes, a calculation being made, a decision reached. His body language subtly changed, tension gathering in specific muscle groups that Mason recognized from years of predator encounters. He was preparing to move. "Mason," Eliza said quietly, having noticed the same warning signs. "He's not alone anymore." Mason turned slightly, following her gaze without losing control of his prisoner. Through the trees below, two more figures in tactical gear were ascending rapidly, weapons drawn. Their approach pattern was disciplined and professional, a standard flanking maneuver designed to create crossfire. "Inside the cave," Mason instructed. "Eliza," his voice low and urgent, "take position at the entrance with the rifle. Timber will stay with you." "What about you?" Eliza protested. You can't handle all three." Mason's weathered face showed no fear, only calm determination. "I've been outmanned by predators before." He checked his restraints on Mercer once more. "The difference is, these predators don't know these mountains. I do." He retrieved a small radio from his pocket, one he'd taken from the snowmobiles during his sabotage operation. "Take this, Channel 3. 1 click for warning, 2 for all clear." Eliza accepted the radio reluctantly, clearly torn between following his instructions and staying to help. Timber made the decision for her, herding her firmly toward the ridge ascent. "The laptop's in my pack," Mason added as she turned to go, "hidden by the lightning-struck pine at the north corner of the clearing. If I don't come back, get it to Sheriff Tanner. Only him, directly, no one else." The gravity of his words hung between them, an acknowledgement that what came next would be dangerous beyond measure. Eliza nodded once, understanding. Then, with Timber at her side, she began the climb back to the ridge cave. Mason watched until she was safely out of the line of fire before turning his attention to the approaching agents and his restrained prisoner. The winter afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the snow-covered slope. Soon darkness would add another dimension to the deadly equation. With methodical calm, Mason secured Mercer to a tree, ensuring he couldn't interfere but wasn't at risk from the impending confrontation. Then, retrieving his hunting knife, Mason Reed stepped into the deepening shadows of the forest he knew better than any man alive. The hunters were about to discover what it meant to become prey in the domain of the lone wolf. Dusk descended rapidly over the mountains, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a canvas of blue shadows and amber highlights from the setting sun. From her position at the cave entrance, Eliza had a commanding view of the ridge and slopes below. Timber sat beside her, a silent sentinel whose yellow eyes missed nothing in the gathering darkness. The radio at her belt remained silent. In the 30 minutes since she'd left Mason, she'd tracked the movements of the two agents through brief glimpses as they worked their way up the mountain. Their tactical approach had been disrupted when Mason disappeared into the forest. They'd immediately shifted to a defensive posture, clearly recognizing the threat he posed. Now they moved more cautiously, back to back, covering each other as they advanced. Their original flanking strategy had been abandoned in favor of consolidated strength. Even from this distance, Eliza could read their body language. These were trained operatives accustomed to urban environments, suddenly finding themselves in unfamiliar territory against an opponent who had every advantage. A flicker of movement in her peripheral vision drew Eliza's attention to a different section of the forest. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then, like a shadow detaching from deeper darkness, a figure emerged briefly between trees before vanishing again. Mason, He was working his way around behind the agents, using terrain and fading light to mask his approach. The wolf dog beside her tensed slightly, reading something in the situation that Eliza couldn't perceive. She placed a steadying hand on his thick fur, whispering, "Easy, Timber. Let him work." Inside the cave, she'd discovered more than just the emergency supplies Mason had mentioned. A weathered metal box contained old photographs, Mason as a younger man, standing beside an older version of himself who must have been his father. Several showed Mason with various wolf dogs over the decades, the lineage of his current companions clearly visible in their distinctive features. But most revealing had been a single, faded photograph at the bottom of the box. A young woman, with auburn hair and striking green eyes, laughing beside a mountain lake. On the back, in neat handwriting, Catherine, Bitterroot Lake, July 1993. Her grandmother, decades younger than Eliza, had ever known her. The resemblance between them was unmistakable, lending physical confirmation to the story Catherine had shared on her deathbed. This woman had loved the wilderness and the solitary trapper who had made it his home, enough to carry his memory. For a lifetime, even as she built a different life far away, the sound of the radio jolted Eliza from her thoughts, a single click, Mason's warning signal. She immediately tightened her grip on the rifle, scanning the slope below with renewed vigilance. Something had changed in the tactical situation. She didn't have to wait long to discover what. From his secured position against the tree, Agent Mercer suddenly called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "Jackson Reeves, the girl is in the ridge cave. Repeat, target is in the ridge cave." The warning was meant for his teammates, but it also served to alert Eliza that her position was compromised. The agents immediately changed direction, moving with greater urgency toward her location. They had abandoned all pretense of stealth now, focusing solely on reaching their objective before Mason could intervene. Timber growled softly beside her, sensing the imminent threat. Eliza calculated her options rapidly. The cave offered defensible shelter, but would become a trap if the agents reached the entrance. The plateau outside provided limited cover, but no escape route except back down the very slope the agents were ascending. Making her decision, Eliza retreated into the cave long enough to gather essential supplies into her pack. The rifle would be her primary defense, but she also secured a hunting knife from Mason's emergency cache. With Timber at her side, she moved away from the cave entrance, seeking higher ground on the ridgeline itself. A narrow game trail, barely visible in the fading light, led upward from the plateau. Eliza followed it, trusting Timber's superior night vision to guide their path. The wolf dog moved with confident purpose, occasionally pausing to ensure she kept pace despite her injured arm. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Boots on stone, the metallic click of weapons being readied. Eliza increased her pace, pushing through fatigue and pain. The trail steepened, requiring her to use her good arm to pull herself up in places, the rifle slung awkwardly across her back. They reached a natural overlook just as full darkness descended over the mountains. Below, Eliza could see flashlight beams as the agents reached the cave entrance. Their voices carried faintly, terse commands and tactical communications as they discovered the cave empty. From this vantage point, Eliza had a clear line of sight to the plateau. If forced to use the rifle, she would have the advantage of elevation and concealment, but her instinct was to avoid confrontation if possible, to remain hidden until Mason could neutralize the threat. That plan dissolved when one of the agents emerged from the cave and immediately began scanning the ridge with a tactical flashlight. The powerful beam swept across the rocky terrain, methodically searching for signs of her passage. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the game trail. Eliza pressed herself flat against the rock face, momentarily out of the light's reach. Timber had already positioned himself deeper in the shadows, his dark coat blending perfectly with the night. The radio at her belt remained silent. No signal from Mason. The beam of light found the beginning of the game trail, paused, then started to track upward. Eliza knew she had seconds before it reached her position. Drawing the rifle forward, she prepared to defend herself if necessary. Just as the light was about to expose her hiding place, a strange, eerie howl echoed through the canyon, not from nearby but from somewhere deep in the forest below. The agent's flashlight immediately swung in that direction, momentarily diverted by the primal sound. Eliza recognized the howl, not Timber's voice, but Ash's. Mason was using his companion to create a distraction. The tactic worked. Both agents turned their attention toward the forest, communicating in terse professional shorthand about a potential threat from that direction. Taking advantage of their distraction, Eliza continued along the ridge trail, moving as silently as possible while maintaining distance between herself and the agents. Timber followed, his paws finding secure purchase, even on the treacherous terrain. They had traveled perhaps 100 yards when a sharp crack shattered the night's silence. A gunshot, followed immediately by a second. Eliza froze, heart hammering. The shots had come from the direction of the forest where Mason had been operating. For several agonizing seconds, absolute silence reigned. Then chaos erupted below. Shouts, another gunshot, the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. Eliza strained to make sense of the confusion in the darkness. One of the agents had returned to the plateau and was shouting into a radio, apparently trying to contact his partner. The flashlight beam swung wildly as he moved, creating disorienting patterns of light and shadow across the mountainside. Then, with shocking suddenness, the light dropped to the ground and stayed there, still illuminated but now pointing uselessly at the sky. No further sounds came from the plateau. Eliza waited, barely breathing, unsure what had transpired. Had Mason neutralized the agent, or had something gone catastrophically wrong? The radio at her belt finally crackled to life. 2 clicks. Mason's. All clear signal. Relief flooded through her, though tempered with caution. 2 clicks meant immediate danger had passed, but not necessarily that the situation was fully resolved. After ensuring no movement came from the plateau below, Eliza carefully retraced her steps along the ridge trail. Timber led the way, moving with greater confidence now that they were returning to familiar ground. As they approached the plateau, Eliza kept the rifle ready, unwilling to fully trust the all-clear until she assessed the situation herself. The flashlight still lay where it had fallen, creating a small pool of light in the darkness. "Mason," she called softly, not wanting to give away her position to any remaining threats. "Here." His voice came from near the cave entrance, pitched low but steady. Eliza moved cautiously forward, Timber now ranging slightly ahead. As she reached the plateau, the scene became clearer. One agent lay unconscious near the dropped flashlight, securely restrained with what appeared to be his own zip ties. Of the second agent and Mercer, there was no sign. Mason emerged from the shadows near the cave, moving with a slight favoring of his left leg that hadn't been present earlier. "Are you hurt?" Eliza asked immediately. "Nothing serious," he replied, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. "Bullet grazed my calf, already wrapped it." In the dim light from the fallen flashlight, Eliza could see evidence of the recent struggle. Disturbed snow, dark spatters that could only be blood, a discarded sidearm that Mason had apparently secured from one of the agents. "Where are the others?" she asked, scanning the darkness. "Second agent went down the slope badly wounded. His partner will need medical attention once he wakes up." Mason's tone was matter-of-fact, lacking any hint of remorse or concern. "Mercer broke free during the commotion. He's in the wind, probably heading back to their vehicles." "Which aren't going anywhere," Eliza remembered, recalling Mason's sabotage. "Correct. But he still has a radio, and if he reaches higher ground, he might get a signal out." Mason checked his watch, barely visible in the faint light. We have maybe a 2-hour window before reinforcements could possibly reach this area, assuming. He gets a distress call through. Eliza processed this information rapidly. What's our play? A ghost of a smile crossed Mason's weathered face, visible even in the poor light. The question and phrasing were exactly what he would have used, evidence of their shared blood despite decades of separation. We need that laptop, he said, and we need to get it and ourselves somewhere secure to assess what we're dealing with. He led the way back into the cave, where a small propane lantern now provided better illumination. Mason moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to rapid tactical adjustments, gathering specific items from the emergency cache while leaving others. There's a Forest Service fire observation cabin about 4 miles northwest of here, he explained as he worked. Unmanned this time of year, but solid shelter, off any standard maps. I've maintained it unofficially for years as a secondary fallback position. Can you make that distance with your injury? Eliza asked, noting the blood-stained bandage visible through the torn fabric of his pants. I've covered more ground with worse, Mason replied simply. The question is whether you can. Your arm hasn't had time to properly heal, and you've already pushed yourself hard today. Eliza straightened, determination visible in her posture. I can make it, Mason nodded, accepting her assessment without argument. We'll travel light, essential survival gear only. I need to retrieve the laptop from its hiding place near the clearing. That means approaching my cabin, where Mercer is likely headed. We go together, Eliza said immediately. For a moment, Mason looked as though he might argue, then seemed to reconsider. Agreed. 2 sets of eyes are better in this situation. Timber will lead. Ash will guard our rear. They'll detect anyone approaching long before we could. As if understanding his role, Timber moved to the cave entrance, alert and ready. From somewhere in the darkness outside, Ash's answering whine confirmed his presence. Before departing, Mason knelt beside the unconscious agent, checking his restraints and vital signs. The man would live, though he'd wake with a substantial headache from the calculated blow Mason had delivered to disable him without causing permanent injury. What about him? Eliza asked. He'll be fine until his people find him, Mason replied. The cold is actually working in his favor, slowing bleeding and swelling, but I've left him enough insulation to prevent hypothermia. The ethical treatment of even those who had come to harm her impressed Eliza, revealing another facet of the complex man who was her grandfather. Mason Reed was capable of necessary violence when threatened, but retained a fundamental code that prevented unnecessary cruelty. They departed the cave under full darkness, navigating by starlight and the wolf dog's superior senses. Mason moved with surprising agility despite his injury, setting a pace that challenged Eliza without overtaxing her recovering strength. Their route down the ridge differed from her earlier ascent, a more gradual descent using natural features that minimized exposure while providing multiple cover positions if needed. Mason traveled with his hand, often resting on Timber's back, reading the wolf dog's muscle tension as an early warning system. When they reached the forest below, Mason paused, orienting himself with what seemed like an internal compass. My cabin is roughly half a mile southeast. We'll approach from the north side, using the creek bed for concealment. Eliza nodded, following his lead as they moved through the dark forest. The night had grown considerably colder, their breath forming dense clouds with each exhalation. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots, though they chose their steps carefully to minimize noise. After 20 minutes of cautious travel, Mason raised his hand in a silent command to stop. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, was the dark outline of his cabin. No lights showed from within, but that meant little. Mercer would operate in darkness if he had reached this location. Both wolf dogs had grown alert, heads forward, scenting the air. Their behavior confirmed Mason's suspicion. Someone was near the cabin. "Stay here with Ash," Mason whispered. "Timber and I will circle around to check the laptop cache. If anything happens, 2 short whistles means retreat. To the ridge cave, 3 means come to my position." Before Eliza could protest, he had melted into the darkness with Timber at his side, leaving her with the equally imposing but slightly smaller Ash. The wolf dog pressed against her leg, a reassuring presence in the cold darkness. Minutes passed, with agonizing slowness, as Eliza strained to detect any sound or movement from the direction Mason had gone. Ash remained calm beside her, which she took as a positive sign. The animal would certainly react if his master were in danger. A single, sharp whistle pierced the silence, Mason's signal that he'd reached the cache. Eliza tensed, waiting for the next communication. Long seconds stretched into nearly 2 minutes of complete silence. Then, faintly, came 2 short whistles, the signal to retreat. Something had gone wrong. Eliza hesitated, torn between following Mason's instructions and going to his aid. Ash made a soft, whining sound, clearly detecting her indecision. The wolf dog's ears were pricked forward, his body language suggesting alertness but not alarm. Making her decision, Eliza moved forward instead of retreating, keeping low and using trees for cover. Ash followed, seemingly approving of her choice to advance rather than withdraw. They approached the edge of the clearing where Mason's cabin stood, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. From this vantage point, Eliza could just make out the lightning-struck pine Mason had mentioned, a tall, dead tree at the north corner of the clearing, its upper third shattered by some long-ago storm. Near its base, a dark figure crouched, barely distinguishable from the surrounding shadows. Mercer had found the cache. Eliza raised the rifle, steadying it against a tree trunk. The distance was approximately 70 yards, a difficult shot in daylight, nearly impossible in darkness without proper optics. But she didn't need to hit him, just create a distraction. Before she could fire, another shadow materialized behind Mercer, Mason, moving with the silent efficiency of a predator. Eliza held her breath, finger easing off the trigger as she watched the confrontation unfold. Mercer sensed the threat too late. He began to turn, a hand moving toward his waistband, but Mason was already striking, a swift, brutal blow to a nerve cluster that momentarily paralyzed the agent's right arm. The laptop case Mercer had been holding dropped to the snow as the 2 men grappled in near-silent combat. Despite his injured leg, Mason fought with the calculated precision of someone intimately familiar with violence. His techniques weren't the polished martial arts of formal training, but the pragmatic, efficient movements of a man who had survived decades in an unforgiving wilderness. Mercer, however, was no amateur. He recovered quickly from the initial attack, countering with trained responses that spoke of extensive close combat experience. The 2 men were evenly matched in different ways. Mason with his raw power and wilderness-honed instincts, Mercer with his tactical training and technical skill. As the struggle intensified, Eliza realized she couldn't risk a shot without potentially hitting Mason. Instead, she signaled to Ash, who immediately understood her intent. The wolf dog slipped away into the darkness, circling to approach the fight from another angle. The combat shifted toward the tree line as each man sought advantage. Mason was gradually forcing Mercer away from the laptop, which lay forgotten in the snow. Eliza recognized the strategy. Mason was creating distance to allow her to secure their objective. Taking the opportunity, she moved forward in a crouching run, keeping to the shadows at the clearing's edge. When she reached the lightning-struck pine, she quickly retrieved the laptop case, slinging it securely across her back. A sudden, pained grunt drew her attention back to the fight. Mason had been driven to one knee, his injured leg finally betraying him. Mercer pressed his advantage, drawing a combat knife from a concealed sheath. The metallic gleam of the blade caught the starlight as Mercer moved in for a decisive strike. Eliza raised her rifle again, but before she could fire, a dark blur exploded from the forest edge, Ash launching himself at Mercer with silent, deadly purpose. The impact sent both man and wolf dog tumbling. Mercer's knife slashed wildly, but found only air as Ash danced away from the blade with preternatural agility. The distraction was enough for Mason to regain his footing and re-enter the fight. What happened next occurred with such speed that Eliza could barely process the sequence. Mercer, recognizing the changing odds, made a desperate move, hurling his knife directly at Mason while simultaneously drawing a concealed pistol from an ankle holster. The blade caught Mason across the forearm, drawing blood but failing to disable. As Mercer brought the pistol to bear, Mason closed the distance with a surge of speed that belied his injuries. One hand deflected the weapon, while the other delivered a precise strike to Mercer's throat, not enough to crush the windpipe, but sufficient to temporarily stop all breathing. Mercer dropped to his knees, the pistol falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched at his throat, struggling for air. Mason kicked the weapon away and stepped back, his own breathing labored from exertion. "Secure the laptop," he called to Eliza, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "We need to move immediately." Eliza emerged from the shadows, the laptop case already secured across her back. "Got it. Are you all right?" Mason was examining the knife wound on his forearm, which bled freely but didn't appear life-threatening. "I'll manage. This isn't over yet." As if confirming his words, a new sound reached them, the distant but unmistakable thrum of helicopter rotors, still miles away but approaching. Somehow, despite Mason's sabotage efforts, a distress call had reached the outside world. Reinforcements were inbound. Mason quickly secured Mercer with the agent's own restraints, ensuring he could breathe but not pursue. The man glared up at them with cold hatred, no longer maintaining any pretense of being there for Eliza's protection. "Enjoy your temporary advantage," Mercer wheezed, his voice raspy from the throat strike. "When my team arrives, there won't be enough left of either of you to identify." Mason regarded him dispassionately. "We'll be long gone by then." He turned to Eliza. "Change of plans. The fire observation cabin is too obvious a destination now. We need to disappear completely." "Where?" Eliza asked, already calculating their dwindling options. A hint of grim determination crossed Mason's face. "There's one place they won't think to look, and couldn't access even if they did, but it means traveling through terrain few would attempt in daylight, let alone at night." The helicopter sound grew marginally louder, still distant, but with clear intent toward their location. Time was running short. Mason whistled softly, calling both wolf dogs to his side. They appeared instantly, alert and ready. To Ash, he gave a specific hand signal that the animal clearly understood, sending him bounding off into the darkness on some predetermined mission. "Timber will lead us," Mason explained, checking his compass briefly. "We're heading west, into the deep backcountry. There's a system of caves I've mapped over the decades. We can hole up there, assess what's on the laptop, and plan our next move." Eliza nodded, mentally preparing herself for what promised to be an arduous journey. "What about your wound?" Mason had already wrapped his forearm with a field dressing. "And from his pack, it can wait. Right now, our priority is distance and concealment." With Timber leading the way, they disappeared into the forest, leaving behind the unconscious agents, the sabotage snowmobiles, and the cabin that had been Mason's sanctuary for decades. The helicopter's sound continued to grow, but they would be invisible beneath the dense canopy of pines, their tracks obscured by the fresh snowfall that had begun to drift lazily from the night sky. Ahead lay unknown dangers, but also the possibility of answers, both to the conspiracy that had nearly claimed Eliza's life and to the more personal questions that had brought her to these mountains in the first place. With each step into the wilderness, she felt a strange dual sensation, moving deeper into unfamiliar territory while somehow simultaneously coming home. 3 months later, spring's first tentative warmth began to soften the Bitterroot Mountains. Patches of bare ground emerged between lingering snowdrifts, and the creek's ice had yielded to rushing meltwater. Inside, the small cabin nestled against the western ridge, not Mason's original home, but a lesser-known trapper's shelter he'd maintained for decades. Eliza Winters sat beside a crackling fire, the silver locket open in her palm. The photograph inside had gained a companion, a small, carefully trimmed image of Mason with Eliza, Timber, and Ash flanking them, taken by Sheriff Tanner 6 weeks earlier when the dust had finally settled. The evidence on the laptop had proven more damning than even Eliza had realized. Through encrypted files and buried code, she'd uncovered not just falsified safety data, but documentation of deliberate testing on unwitting military personnel, resulting in injuries that had been systematically covered up. The files had included internal communications naming high-ranking government officials who had been paid to look the other way, extending all the way to certain elements within the FBI. It had been Sheriff Tanner who ultimately helped them navigate the treacherous waters of determining who could be trusted. His decades-long friendship with Mason had proven invaluable as he facilitated contact with legitimate federal investigators from an independent oversight division, bypassing the compromised channels that Mercer and his team had represented. The scandal, once exposed, had rocked the defense industry. Morgan Reese Technologies' stock had plummeted, its executives facing federal charges, its government contracts suspended pending comprehensive review. The wider investigation had ensnared 3 senior FBI officials, 2 military procurement officers, and a deputy assistant secretary of defense. Eliza's role as whistleblower had been kept anonymous at her insistence, though she had testified behind closed doors to a special congressional committee. Her future safety had been secured through a combination of new identity documents and the natural obscurity provided by the remote mountain location she now called home. The cabin door opened, admitting Mason and a gust of pine-scented air. At 63, he moved with the same quiet strength she'd witnessed on that first desperate night, though the encounters with Mercer's team had left their marks, a new scar on his forearm, a slight but permanent stiffness in his left leg. "Sheriff." "Radioed," he said, hanging his worn canvas jacket on a peg by the door. Final sentencing came down for Mercer. 20 years, no possibility of parole. Eliza nodded, closing the locket and returning it to its place around her neck. Justice had been served, though the cost had been high. 2 lives completely transformed, a generational secret revealed, and a wilderness sanctuary forever altered by the intrusion of the outside world. "Supply helicopter coming tomorrow," Mason continued, warming his hands by the fire. "Last chance to change your mind about staying." The question wasn't asked with any real expectation of a different answer than the one she'd given consistently over the past months. Eliza had adapted to mountain life with surprising ease, her urban skills complementing Mason's wilderness knowledge in unexpected ways. The genetic predisposition towards self-reliance and independence that flowed through both their veins had found its natural expression here among the pines and peaks. "My place is here now," she said simply. A rare smile crossed Mason's weathered features. "Your grandmother would be proud. She always loved these mountains, even if she couldn't stay." "I think she'd be proud of both of us," Eliza replied. "For finding each other, for fixing what was broken." Outside, Timber and Ash raised their voices in unison, a harmonized howl that echoed across the valley. Not an alarm, but a greeting. They detected the approach of someone familiar. Minutes later, Sheriff Tanner appeared at the tree line, leading his horse through the melting snow rather than riding. "Thought I'd deliver this in person," he called as he approached, patting a leather saddlebag. "Too important for the regular supply drop." Once inside, He produced a sealed envelope bearing Catherine Sullivan's handwriting, the final piece of correspondence from Eliza's grandmother, entrusted to her lawyer with instructions to deliver it only after certain conditions had been met. With slightly trembling fingers, Eliza broke the seal and withdrew several pages of elegant handwriting. She read silently for several minutes, tears gathering but not falling. When finished, she handed the letter to Mason, who accepted it with equal reverence. The words told the story they'd pieced together in fragments over the past months, but with new details that filled crucial gaps. Catherine's discovery of her pregnancy just days before her planned return to graduate school. Her agonizing decision to leave without telling Mason, believing his commitment to the wilderness life would force him to choose between his calling and his child. Her decades of regret as she realized the choice had never been hers to make. B. Final paragraphs spoke directly to them both, as if Catherine had somehow foreseen that they would eventually find each other. To my beloved granddaughter and to Mason, the only man I ever truly loved, I leave you my deepest apology and my most fervent hope, that in finding each other you might forge a connection that transcends my mistakes. The silver locket was always meant to return to the mountains, just as a part of my heart never left them. Mason, the life we might have shared exists now only in dreams, but through Eliza, something of us both continues. Eliza, in finding your grandfather, you have found the missing piece of yourself, the wilderness heritage that called to you even across generations. Together, you are my legacy and my redemption. Sheriff Tanner quietly excused himself, sensing the privacy the moment demanded. After he'd gone, Mason and Eliza sat in companionable silence as afternoon light filtered through the cabin windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories given physical form. "I've been thinking about the North Ridge property," Mason said finally. "Good location for a second cabin, better visibility, access to the high meadow for summer hunting." Eliza understood the unspoken meaning, a place of her own, close enough for connection, but separate enough for independence. The Kati, perfect balance for two people who shared blood and temperament, who had found each other against impossible odds. "I'll help you scout it next week," she agreed. As dusk settled over the mountains, Eliza stepped onto the porch, Mason beside her, the wolf dogs alert at their feet. The silver locket caught the day's last light, gleaming momentarily like a star. Brought down to earth, below the valley stretched into deepening shadow, above peaks still glowed with sunshine's lingering touch. This was her legacy now, not just Catherine's DNA or Mason's blood, but this wild place that had nearly taken her life before ultimately saving it. The wilderness that had forged Mason Reed had recognized something of itself in Eliza Winters, calling her home through time and distance, through secrets and silvered photographs, through blizzard and danger and revelation. She had journeyed to these mountains seeking answers about her past. She would remain because she had found her future. As if sensing her thoughts, Mason placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, the simple gesture containing decades of unspoken emotions. No words were needed between them now. Like the ancient pines that surrounded them, they had weathered their storm and emerged scarred but standing, roots intertwined beneath the surface, stronger together than apart. The wilderness had claimed them both in different ways across different generations, and in that claiming had ultimately set them free. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.